Last year, he caught 0 touchdowns.
Yeah.
0. Guy had 147 targets. But Diontae Johnson, hugely underrated. I look at his route tree, and it's nearly full-on green, Matt Harmon. Short to intermediate area mastermind is Diontae Johnson.
Look at the release.
There's your separation.
Great route.
Stutter and go. Gets by clean.
That is unbelievable.
Maybe the greatest catch I've ever seen.
Diontae Johnson. This is a dude that, every year it's something, whether it's the drop passes, whether it's last year he caught 0 touchdowns.
Yeah.
0. Guy had 147 targets. I think, and I'd have to go check my math on this, but I think he's now approached 200 total targets with no touchdowns, which is that's impossible. That's impossible. 147, 86 catches for 882 receiving yards. That's abysmal. How do you get 147 targets and not crack 900 yards? Well, the 58.5% catch rate will certainly aid in that number as well. But Diontae Johnson, hugely underrated. I look at his route tree, and it's nearly full-on green, Matt Harmon. Short to intermediate area mastermind is Diontae Johnson.
Look, Diontae Johnson's, I agree with you. I think he is one of the most underrated receivers in the NFL. And, I said this on Twitter this week that we throw around the word elite too often. I am totally guilty of throwing around elite too often. And Diontae Johnson is not an elite player. He is actually a pretty flawed player in some ways. I mean, you mentioned the drop stuff. That it's not nearly as big of a problem as it was the 2020 season when he had an absurd drop rate. And, it was just a lot of that is kind of those short little routes. You're going to get those are where most drops occur. So there was a little bit of kind of chicken and egg sort of thing there. The yards after catch stuff where he's get going downfield, pal, when you got the ball in your hands. He's pretty high on the boneheaded play scale, is Diontae Johnson.
Diontae Johnson loves to take a step backward after catching a pass,
Yeah,
it's buddy, you're at the line, just fall forward. It's a first down, my guy.
All that being said, you can absolutely use the word elite when you talk about his route running, because he is up there. And last year, 85th percentile success rate versus man, 88th against zone, 84th against press. Just checking all the boxes there, really good. It wasn't even one of his best seasons in terms of his RP success rates. Almost had the full green route tree going at or above the NFL average on every single route. And I think that's sort of where Diontae is a misunderstood player.
Okay. Because
I think people look at him as some people even think he's a slot receiver, which is crazy because he's actually played he's played more X receiver than almost anybody else the last 3 years, right. 2020 to 2022. Took a little bit less snaps at X last year with George Pickens being there, which might be good long-term. But, this is a guy who's played that position, and he is not just winning on little bunny hop routes, which I think people still can't separate Ben Roethlisberger, what he was doing versus, what feeding Diontae on those short little routes because he couldn't push the ball down the field. But this is a guy in Diontae Johnson who wins 92.3% success rate on digs, 89.7% success rate on out routes, curl routes, 89.8%. 9 routes is 56.6%. That's within the NFL average. Great on corner routes, great on post routes. He wins at all 3 levels. It just, his ADOT jumped last year, no surprise, with guys even in Mitch Trubisky and Kenny Pickett who don't have howitzers, but they have bigger arms than Ben Roethlisberger. It's no surprise. Sometimes average depth of target is not always a wide receiver stat. Sometimes it's a quarterback stat. I think that's a really good example of it there. So I just maintain that this guy he's not one of the best receivers in the NFL or anything, but he's certainly, I think, a really underrated player who's a true number one and can win at all 3 levels of the field. He's just played in one of my least favorite offenses in Matt Canada's offense, which we can come back to, but also, played with some questionable quarterback play the last 4 years.
Yeah, Matt Canada's offense certainly not doing any favors either. Very simplistic, very basic. But, Matt, I take a look at his percentile scores too, 85th percentile versus man, 88th percentile versus zone. So when we start talking about those are elite receivers, Diontae Johnson has a seat at the table, man. Like, he deserves at least to be part of that conversation. It's just that the total counting stats don't necessarily add up. And again, it's just those high profile, very magnified negative plays that take him away from that conversation. I can't stress this enough. The fact that he's got a 92.3% success rate on the dig, 89.8% success rate on the curl, in breaking routes that just, I mean, you got to have some stones running those routes, man. And you know what? He's open. That's crazy to me. This is the area of the field in the NFL where if you win there, you're winning, man. That's where teams get beat, is it not? I mean, come on, Diontae Johnson, an absolute weapon for the Steelers. They got to figure out a way to get him the ball in more advantageous situations.
Right, because he always has, a ton of targets, and people in the fantasy industry, particularly, I think, just looking at like nonsense stats and stats that aren't wide receiver isolating are always like digging on like, his efficiency, yards per target. I give me a freaking break with yards per target, but like always kind of banging on Diontae in that way. It's why does he have so many targets when he's so inefficient? It's because the type of targets he gets are super inefficient, and especially the route combinations in this offense, particularly. It's a lot of go routes and like hitch routes, short, curls, little inside breaking, some short comeback stuff like that. And by the way, you're just like drawn dead against cover two, like all these like too high defenses that are right now that so many teams are running, these like zone shells and stuff. Those are the worst routes to try to beat those type of defense. And this stuff matters so much. And like, we don't talk about it enough, but it's so true that if you're trying to beat man coverage, it makes sense. You run a go route over top of a guy. And Diontae's not like, he's not a very athletic, not very fast player. Even then it's like, we don't need him running a ton of go routes, even if he's a solid, not great separator on those go routes. It's like, you're asking a lot in terms, just win with all craft and all route running, which he does, but you're asking a lot. Those comeback routes, it's like, think about just a cover two defense. You're curling right back into those zones. And even if you work yourself open eventually, like Diontae clearly does, by then you've got a quarterback behind a bad offensive line. Like, he's probably moved off that read, at this point. He's trying to scramble. Kenny Pickett, big scrambler, stuff like that. We talked about Deontay's dig route success rate. Did a little bit better job about that towards the back half of the season, and we just have to see that continue. We have to. We've got to get this guy running more post routes, running more dig routes, running more crossing routes. Like, his slant route, post routes, like route percentage, how often he was running those routes, is below the NFL average. Like, those have got to come up. And same with George Pickens too. Like, we got to get George Pickens on more routes than just slant and just curls and goes. We have to. Even he's obviously not there like Diontae is as a route runner, but it's got to happen for this offense to take a step. And by the way, if it does, like, I think there's a lot to like about this offense. Even if I don't know what Kenny Pickett's ceiling is, I think he could be a functional, like, good starting quarterback, like maybe, somewhere around the middle of the league. And I love these receivers. I think even if I have questions about George Pickens, I like, George Pickens as an X receiver somewhere on that Devontae Parker axis that we always talk about. Obviously I love Diontae Johnson, and no one wants to hear it, but like, I think Allen Robinson is a pretty good fit as the Steelers' big slot receiver as opposed to the Rams perimeter X receiver. And Freiermuth's a good tight end. Like, they've got Najee Harris. They beefed up the offensive line. So if we could just get Matt Canada along for the ride and maybe not, again, drawn dead against cover two on a week-by-week basis, this offense has something here, I think, in Pittsburgh.